Well, good morning. Thank you for joining this AEM informational webinar on the China non-road Stage 4 engine emission regulations that are soon to be released. This regulation is currently in development, and while it hasn't been published yet, it'll impact not only engine manufacturers, but also equipment manufacturers in ways that previous regulations haven't. Therefore, we're bringing this information to you, recognizing that it's subject to change. With the proposed implementation date that seems fixed at January of 2020, we believe you, as equipment manufacturers, need to be aware of some of the unique provisions that this regulation requires. Today we have two speakers, Amy Wang, the Technical and Service Manager in the AEM China office located in Beijing, China. Amy has been supporting the AEM China Engine Emissions Committee work since 2012 and serves as the committee secretary. Amy has been very involved in many of the discussions and negotiations as this regulation has been developed. We also have Chris Walters, who leads the Engine Emissions Regulatory Affairs Group at CNH Industrial, which is based in Burr Ridge, Illinois, right near Chicago. Chris also chairs the Mobile Off-Highway Committee at the U.S.-based Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. Both Chris and Amy have been very involved in discussions with the Chinese regulators representing EMA and AEM respectively. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Amy. So Amy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mike. I will open our co-presented session today by introducing a number of must-know background information and facts related to the China Non-Road 4 standards draft. And then Mr. Chris Waters will guide you through all the key technical requirements and the details related to the drafted regulation. And finally, I will add some coming policy-related information to close our session today. Now, let's get into our slides. When dealing with the non-road emissions work in China, here is a list of the key agencies and organizations you will most likely to encounter with. MEE, Ministry of Ecology and the Environment. This is the ultimate government agency responsible for all emission-related matters in China. Second one is CREAS, Chinese Research Academy of Environmental Sciences. It's directly under the management of MEE and is one of MEE's major research arm institutions. And basically all the final drafts of emission-related policies, regulations, and standards go to CREAS for the final round of review. The third one is VECC, Vehicle Emission Control Center. It's under the management of CREAS. And the VECC is the enforcement center under MEE for emission-related issues. And one major work aspect for VECC is the information disclosure, which we will talk a little bit more about on slide number 4 of this presentation. And the fourth one is JNATC, the Jinan Automobile Test Center. It's a third-party test center, but because it's quite a close working relationship with MEE, and JNATC has a lot of expertise in the technical matters as well as the testing experience. So this test center has been one of the most important major drafting organizations for the Chinese non-road Stage 1 to Stage 4 regulations so far. The Chinese Air Pollution Law, this is the short, handy name that we give this law, but its full name is the Law on Prevention and Control of Atmospheric Pollution. First version released in 1988 and has been revised a few times, and the latest version was revised in 2015 and has been effective since January the 1st, 2016. And in its Article 51, the law requires All the non-road mobile machine emissions shall not exceed requirements of relative standards, and this covers manufacturing, importing, and selling of all the non-road mobile machines. With this requirement, now the non-road mobile machine manufacturers are becoming the regulated body. This is a huge difference from the previous requirements and the practice. However, we have no applicable standard yet, even until today. We have only the GB 20891 2014 version. And from the title shown here, you can see this standard covers only the engine-related requirements, not machine-related requirements as defined by the revised air pollution law. And in the law's Article 52, it says, non-road mobile machinery manufacturers shall conduct emission inspections on newly manufactured non-road mobile machines, and the inspection information shall be publicized to the society. So with this requirement, to fulfill this requirement, now we have the so-called information disclosure system, which was developed by VECC under the direction of MEE. And for the information disclosure, the related legal responsibility now lies merely on the non-road mobile machinery manufacturer. As to the engine manufacturers, the compliance with the information disclosure requirements or not is optional. However, as the engine manufacturer, you still have to provide data into the system to assist the non-road mobile machine manufacturer to be able to complete their data submission to the system as required. For the information disclosure, here is some additional information you should know. First, the question is, who should do the information disclosure? So this would be the manufacturer or the importer of the non-road mobile machines. And what is required? The certain labeling requirements are needed, and certain information needs to be publicized on this designated MEE online platform. And the information to be submitted includes information on the non-road mobile machine manufacturer or importer who does the information disclosure work. Secondly, it includes the information on the non-road mobile machinery pollution control technology, which is specified in the GB 20891 2014 version, as well as the information on the non-road mobile machinery emission inspections, including information on the type approval test, COP, in-use conformity, ex-factory inspection, etc. All the related details can be found in additional documents. And one, for the non-road industry sectors, the information disclosure requirements are effective from July the 1st of 2017. And it is working now for the current Chinese non-road stage 3 requirements. And once the Chinese non-road stage 4 regulation is finally released and in effect, this information disclosure system will continue to be applicable with the certain modifications made. Just now we mentioned that the GB 20891 2014 standard, and it only covers engine-related requirements. So to accommodate the requirements on the machine side as directed by the air pollution law related provisions, MEE has been working on the draft of the HJ standard, HJ meaning Mandatory Environmental Industrial Standard. And the title of this standard is Emission Control Technical Requirements of Non-Road Mobile Machinery and Diesel Engine. So this coming HJ standard covers requirements both on the machine side as well as on the engine side. And in the foreword of this standard, it says, this standard specifies stage 4 technical requirements for pollutant emission control of non-road mobile machinery and diesel engines installed in machinery, and is a supplement to stage 4 related content of GB 20891-2014. So theoretically, when we talk about China Non-Road 4, it includes two parts, this HJ standard plus the GB 20891. However, in reality, for our working convenience, if we talk about China Non-Road 4 standards / regulation, usually we refer to this HJ standard. And please remember, all the information on this HJ standard or the Non-Road 4 requirements in China, all the information we are talking about is coming from two sources. The first one is the MEE released draft on Non-Road 4 in February of this year. And the second part comes from oral messages from the MEE officials and or from the drafting committee experts. So all of this information, because now they are still in the drafting process, they might be subject to changes. So please refer to the final release version for your final use. And according to MEE, as the news of this week, the HJ standard or the China Non-Road 4 standard is in its final approval process right now, meaning signing paperwork, having final editorial changes. And MEE expects it to be released probably next month in October of this year. Okay, now I will give the floor to Chris to talk about more details of the China Non-Road 4 standard. To you, Chris.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for starting us off and giving us the background information that we need to understand what is going to happen next. And as we go forward in the slides, you'll be able to see that we're going to talk about sort of the program overview of how China has created the Non-Road 4 program. And so it's not holistically different than the elements that were involved in China Non-Road 3, but there is a little bit of difference and a little bit of enhancement, if you will, in some of the program requirements. So basically, as we talked about in the first few slides, the manufacturer of the engine and the machine will be required to comply, essentially, to the China Non-Road emissions standards, and Amy has done a great job of forming up how those two different standards are going to interact with each other. What I wanted to do to start my information here today was give a basic overview of the basic compliance elements that are envisioned for Non-Road 4. And again, this is sort of conceptual at this point. We'll get into the details and the explicit requirements in further slides. The first item is the type approval test, which is essentially going to be very similar to what we have in Non-Road 3. We will, obviously have to certify a more stringent engine that has after-treatment requirements. But generally, the process for the engine manufacturers to receive a type approval will be pretty similar. There'll be some modifications, but generally speaking, it's similar. The second requirement is production conformity inspections. I would consider this to be something that will also be pretty similar, mainly pulling elements from that GB standard that was referenced on the previous slide. We could see some additional things that I guess could fall in this category, but generally this is going to be pretty similar. Durability requirements, again, something that has been required in non-Road 3 and we expect to be similar in non-Road 4. Essentially, this is, proving that the engine itself will maintain its emissions limits over the durability of the useful life of the engine. The fourth element is a new element, though, in Stage 4, which is in-use conformity requirements. This is quite expansive. We're going to talk about this quite a bit in subsequent slides, and this is really where the program in China is going to start to differentiate itself from other programs in other regions of the world. So now if we go into a bit more detail, we'll talk a bit about the program's status and the basic elements of the non-Road 4 standard. This is somewhat starting off with a repeat of Amy's comments, but the first comment is the draft of this standard. The only draft that's been issued for public review occurred in February of 2018. We are given a very short amount of time to form public comments for submission to the government, and AEM's China Work Group, Engine Committee, and other trade associations around the world, including Japan's, Europe's, and the U.S., all formed joint comments that were submitted to outline many concerns with the program that was proposed. They have obviously gone through those comments. We've met and talked a bit with Jinan and VECC and CRACE on some of those issues. We've also talked to some of the key people at MEE, so we've done a lot of work to talk with some of those entities that Amy had talked about at the beginning of her slides. We now expect, as Amy just mentioned, the final version to be out very soon, but to be clear, it has not been published yet. And so the items I'm giving you here are things that we have very strong confidence that will not change before the final version is issued, but just be aware that some surprises may come up as we go through these lists, but these main program elements are expected to stay the same. The first thing is what are the emissions limits? So we're expecting, and the draft has indicated, EU Stage 3B, which is roughly the same as Tier 4 interim here in the U.S. I've included a table here that actually has the standard requirements. So to be clear, where you would find this information is not in the HJ standard that's being published. These standards are already fixed in the GB standard, so GB 20891-2014. These requirements are already published in that final document. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between things that are already required in the GB standard and things that are proposed in the HJ standard. The second requirement is part of the HJ requirement, the new requirements, wall flow diesel particulate filter. So DPF for engines 37 to 560 kilowatt. That DPF must meet a particle number count, which is sort of a measure that you can use to determine the number of particles that are being captured in grams per kilowatt hour, or in number of particles per kilowatt hour. And that number is shown here, 5 times 10 to the 12th. So essentially, to be clear on this requirement, the requirement is you must install a DPF. It is not a requirement that the engine must meet this standard of 5 times 10 to the 12th. It's basically saying the wall flow filter that you install will need to have a specification that can meet 5 times 10 to the 12th in particle number. So it's a little bit different than the European standard, which just basically forces you to run an engine and show that you meet 1 times 10 to the 12th. Of course, the only way to achieve that with existing technology is with a particle filter. So this is a little bit of a different way of constructing the requirement in the standard. Nonetheless, it is going to force everyone to have the diesel particulate filter for 37 to 560 kilowatt. And one of the biggest program elements that's added in is in-use testing for engines 37 to 560 kilowatt. We're going to talk a lot more about that in subsequent slides. We won't say much more here on this slide, but realize this is a unique element, and the way they've constructed the program, it is much different than the European Stage 5 in-use testing, or in what they call in-service monitoring program, So this is not going to be a pilot program with manufacturers required to submit data. This is actually a conformity factor that you need to meet in use, and a lot of different elements of that program. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a few minutes. Smoke testing, the standard is a little bit confusing at this point in the draft because there is also a national standard that is going to be released that actually specifies the smoke standards, and Amy's going to talk a little bit about that at the end as she finishes up the presentation. So just be aware that there will be requirements for testing smoke and verifying smoke standard is met with the machines that are going into stage 4 product. So it's a little bit confusing. We had a lot of discussions on this with the regulators. This will be clarified hopefully in the final version of the standard, but be aware there will be some elements of maintaining compliance to the national smoke standards as part of this standard. And that is probably confusing, and it should be because of the way they've done it so far, but hopefully it gets clarified and we can gain better understanding when the final version comes out. There will also be emissions component warranty requirements for manufacturers. Again, this is something where it's very confusing because you would think that engine emissions components would be warranted by the engine manufacturer, but the requirements, as Amy had stated very clearly in the air pollution law, will be that the machine manufacturers have to warrant these components. So this one is going to be a new element unique to how it's applied to machine manufacturers. The program itself for warranty will be what we've been told aligned to the U.S. EPA limits. So in terms of years and hours for non-road machinery, non-road engines, this program should be very similar. But again, the entity that is required to apply the warranty for the customer and the end users will be different in China. There will also be a machine positioning and locating requirement, essentially a GPS requirement. I've gone ahead and included in this slide the national standard in China that is expected to be referenced. There is a lot of detailed information about how to meet the requirements for this positioning and locating system in the standard. It's available in the draft. It'll be available in the final version. I'd ask you to please review that. This will be another requirement for the machines. And this is basically something we question quite a bit. Again, it would be a unique standard not required for non-road equipment anywhere else in the world. But China has been insistent that this is something they need for their inspection programs and their field surveillance programs they expect to have as part of the in-use testing. And the last thing we wanted to talk about is the transition period, or as in this case, the lack thereof a transition allowance. So no allowances for production, importation, or the sale to an end customer of any of the previous stage machines after the introduction date. And as I think Amy or Mike have mentioned already, the introduction date is quite near. And you know, just about 16 months from now, you're looking at a full implementation of this standard across the board in all power categories. And of course, no transition period, as I just mentioned. So we have our work cut out for us. If you're lucky enough to have a solution off the shelf to meet these requirements, you're in a very good position. But for companies and manufacturers that will need to develop products to meet these standards, you have a very short lead time to accomplish that. And again, of course, we still do not have the final version of the standard ready at this point, so we're still waiting to know exactly how some of the details that go along with these program elements are going to fit in. One thing I did want to mention here, probably the only thing here that's going to potentially change, is the power range above 560 kilowatt. It is possible they may revert back to a stage 3 limit value in the final version of the standard. This is something the industry has advocated for fairly strong, and there has been some verbal feedback this is possible. So please keep your eye out when the final version comes out on what the eventual final requirements are for engines above 560 kilowatt. And again, these standards are in the GB standard that was referenced earlier. The next thing that we wanted to cover is what machines are going to be regulated in this standard. So the answer here is actually pretty straightforward. There's no change from what was covered in Non-Road 3. For your purposes here and for your note-taking, if you'd like, we have included those categories both for variable and constant speed engines. The one thing I would like to mention, though, in this box that we've pulled up on the slide is going to give you a reminder that stationary engines are not yet confirmed to be included or excluded from this standard. So the Stage 4 standard originally was intended to cover stationary engines from the discussions we've had with the regulators, but they have had some moments of indecision about confirming that. So I do think there's an opportunity for us, if you want to call it that, the stationary engine applications may not be included with the scope of products that are going to be regulated under the Stage 4 standards. We'll have to see when the final version comes out on that. And so now we'll move on to talk about the new program element, the sort of one of a kind. It's only of its kind in the world. The InUse and self-inspection program that China is putting out is, again, different than the European in-service monitoring program in many ways. There are some things that are borrowed from that program, but we wanted to first go through sort of how the program is set up in China and then talk a little bit about what's unique and what's shared between the European program so people have a good understanding of the technical elements of this, but also the programmatic elements that are going to drive how many tests are actually done. So first, for new machines, and I have the word new in quotes here mainly because the definition of the word new is not understood from the draft regulation, but in discussions that we've had with the regulators and the drafters of the standards, we believe we understand what that new machine definition will be. And this, again, is something that machine manufacturers will have to take care of. So this self-inspection plan first starts with emissions testing for new machines using PEMS equipment. So taking a machine off of your production line, perhaps selling it to an end user, letting the end user run the machine, and then within a certain allowance to consider it still to be a new machine, run a test to confirm the conformity in use of the machine. The second thing that can be, that is part of the self-inspection program is actually a random inspection by government agencies. This can include visual inspections, maybe in the field, going out and seeing, does a machine have all of the after-treatment components that are listed in the engine manufacturer's type approval, could be an example of that. Could be something about how do you look at the machine manufacturing process and ensure that all of the emissions components are installed. There could be various things. It's not explicit what a visual inspection really is. The inspection of production line testing and the data, of course, needs to be stored for a certain amount of time. That's all included in the specific details of the standard. And then also emissions tests that can be conducted by government agencies, so sort of like a surveillance program of new machines coming off your production line. And that could be taken to a test lab, I believe. They could run an engine itself in a lab to see if the numbers match the type approval. It could be a PEMS test where they run the machine in the field to get information and data. So it could be a very wide-ranging program. Now, the thing that we want to be clear on is we're not 100% certain of the intention of the government executing all of these elements at any sort of frequency and total number of tests per year or inspections per year. I think they have told us verbally they would like to ensure that they have the ability to go out and inspect and survey machines in the field, but I don't know that they fully appreciated how overwhelming these requirements are when you read them as they've listed them in the standard. So we're hoping to get some clarification in the final standard on the frequency of these sort of inspections and testing, but some of that stuff is included now, some of it's not. Hopefully it will be fully clear by the time the final draft is published. The other thing that they're also talking about is doing inspections basically at customs, so that's not a surprise, but you may also see increased scrutiny of the non-Road 4 machines as they come into the country at customs. So that's only one half of the program. You also have the program for used machines, and again, used is in quotes here because we need to fully understand the definition of what constitutes a used machine. We'll talk about that in a little bit. For the used program, we also have the self-inspection program required for manufacturers. We also have the random inspection by government agencies. And we also have corrective measures for nonconformity. So I've tried to use the words on both the previous slide and in this slide of what is actually listed in the draft standard. So you can go look at that, and hopefully the language is somewhat similar. At least the wording they use can be somewhat similar in the final version. So you can kind of point to these things in the standard when you have a chance to review it and kind of can match this up to the actual language in the standard. So this language is maybe a little bit strange for how we would normally characterize these requirements, but this is the wording that was used in the China draft standard. The nonconformity corrective measures could include recalls. So this is something where, for example, you run a test, you don't meet the requirements, and you fail the test essentially, and then you would get into a discussion with the authorities in China about how to rectify that. You could institute a recall, you could do more testing. It really is a negotiation at that point, I believe, but doesn't limit itself in any way. It could be a potential for a fine, penalties, recall requirements, things like that. So be careful and understand exactly how the scheme works in China for passing the test. How many tests you need to run is one thing, and how many tests you're supposed to do and what records you're supposed to keep. But another element of this, and of course this is beyond what is required in Europe, is you can fail a test, and then when you have a nonconformity, you would have to potentially rectify that those nonconformities. So keep an eye out on those requirements. There's detailed information in some of the annexes of the standard that explain not only how the testing needs to be conducted, but of course what measures are needed and frequency of testing and how many tests you need to pass, things like that. So some additional info, that's really just a black and white version of what's required for new engines or new machines, what's required for used. The one thing I should probably also include here is very key, and I've withheld this information until now to not distract you too much, but this is a key element. The NOx emissions cannot exceed 2.5 times the applicable limit for NOx when you're running your PEMS test. So if we go back, if you were to refer back to the slide two pages earlier with the table that has the requirements, and you looked at the NOx limits, multiplying that standard by 2.5, that's the limit for your test result on PEMS testing, which the PEMS testing requirements are going to be aligned more or less. I don't know if they're identical. I'm not an expert on the EU requirements, but generally speaking, I know that they're very similar in terms of the protocols for the testing and the measurement requirements, things like that. So the InUse program in Europe, the procedures are basically adopted from that for China. The threshold that we expect to see, and hopefully this will be explicit in the final standard, 500 hours is the, under 500 hours would be new, above 500 would be considered used. When you get into your used program, you actually have to get a program. At this point, we're expecting to have the program for each manufacturer approved, or the plan will be approved by the type approval authority. So, you know, probably putting a range into what number of hours and which machine families and engine families you're looking at will be included in those sort of documents. So we're not sure if you can just run an engine at 501 hours or 499 and sort of keep doing that and consider it new and used. We'll have to see if they explain that further, but generally this is the expectation we've gotten through our discussions. The one thing that also keep in mind, the engine manufacturers do have some requirements in the draft standard for running these tests for in-use programs, and again, they're very involved, especially on the used side, to have quite a few tests. We hope that the proposal that the industry has submitted, and I've put a note here at the bottom of this slide, essentially talking about what are we looking at in terms of number of tests and number of machines per year. That seems to be overwhelming based on the draft standard. The indication we have received from the Chinese government is they may be willing to reduce some of that burden and maybe narrow the test requirements down to ensure, again, two basic objectives of theirs, which are to ensure they have the ability to survey in the field used equipment and locate it, and that's where the GPS comes in, to do their own testing and monitoring, and then also to make sure that manufacturers are required to do some testing at, we'll say, infrequent intervals at the minimum for really becoming a better able to do the testing and become, you know, where this program may be able to expand maybe in the future. So these are the last things I wanted to mention about the standards, and so I will pass it back to Amy, who can talk to us a little bit about some of the smoke standards that I referenced earlier, and also conclude our presentation today. And so, Amy, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Very comprehensive introduction of all the key elements. Thank you. So it is actually mentioned in Chapter 7 of the February draft of the HJ standard. It mentioned some smoke-related requirements, which refers to one mandatory national standard that MEE has been working on, and the title is the smoke emission requirement for non-road diesel engine machinery. Right now, according to MEE official, this national mandatory standard on the smoke requirement is also in its final approval process and will be released very soon. And in the expectation of MEE, they plan, if everything goes right, this GB standard on the smoke requirements should be released earlier than the HJ standard, because the HJ standard refers to the requirement of this smoke standard. And currently, there are quite a number of cities and regions in China that have their various local requirements on the smoke emission from non-road mobile machinery engines. And I have listed a few major cities here, but there are a lot more cities and provinces that have similar requirements. We expect that once the national GB standard on smoke requirements is released pretty soon, it will replace these very similar regional requirements, and hopefully will solve all these confusions. And recently reported by the many AEM members that they see more and more frequent local tests and inspection are being conducted to non-road mobile machines in construction site or in the off-road site where they are working by the local environmental protection agencies. and some penalties were given to those who cannot pass the smoke test, or the equipment that didn't pass the test were simply asked to stop working on the site. Next slide, please. Thank you. At the end of August this year, MEE just released a very important guidance document with the title Technology Policy on Non-Road Mobile Machine Pollution Prevention and Control. And in this document, it says that non-road mobile machinery with the compression ignition engines, they shall reach national stage 4 emission level in 2020 and to integrate with the worldwide highest emission level in 2025. And here, by mentioning the meeting the national stage 4 emission level in 2020, this fact echoes the implementation date or the introduction date mentioned in the current non-road stage 4 draft. And we think this has something to do with the very difficult lobbying process that we've had with the Chinese regulators when we mentioned that the introduction date for both engines and the machines to meet as of January the 1st, 2020 will not be enough for the manufacturers. But the Chinese regulators have been very insistent on having the date as at least in 2020. So again, for any of the final information, including the implementation date, please wait to see and refer to the final release, the HJ standard, as we mentioned before. And I believe this is all we have for today's presentation. And Chris, do you have anything to add or comment on?
No, I think we've got it all covered.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris and Amy. This really has been a good comprehensive study, and recognizing that things are subject to change on the short time frame that we're at, we feel it's very important that our members are able to view this presentation. It will be made available on the AEM website, and we will also put a link to this presentation in the Tech newsletter, which will be coming out towards the end of September. That concludes the WebEx for today, and once again, we thank you for joining us.